Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Lisa, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 18th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 26 or Proper 21, which this year falls on September 26th. We do have a couple content notifications for this episode. One is that we do include examples of ableism and exclusion in our conversation in the deep dive. And also, we talk about the Olympic gymnastics abuse investigations when we discuss the gospel reading.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today, for our deep dive, we welcome Pastor Lisa Heffernan, who is serving as an interim pastor in South Dakota and is also the coordinator for ELCA Disability Ministry, both positions she began this summer. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi.
Yay. Lisa, this week one of the common threads through our readings is the question of who is included and who is excluded, or who counts, you might think. We wanted to have you join us because you know a lot about exclusion and inclusion, especially in the church. Can you tell us how you've come to learn so much about that?
Well, I've come to know a lot about that through lived experience. I was born with spina bifida. I am a paraplegic. I use a wheelchair full time, and my father, who passed away in 2004, had multiple sclerosis. And we were a family of four, and church was a huge part of our lives from the get-go. And we know firsthand of being welcomed in lots of places, even basically having a new church building built because our community needed an accessible building, and that meant we were a part of the community. And other places just saying, sit in the back, things like that, or struggling in call processes to have congregations invited to think about what does accessibility mean when their potential pastor has a disability, and how does that accessibility extend not just from a leadership position, but to the congregation they serve. So it's been a huge part of my life from the very beginning.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I just thought of, I think, a lot of times when we talk about accessibility, right, we're talking about in the church, we're talking about people being able to get into the building and to sit in the pews or adjacent to the pews. And I was thinking about how many of the church spaces and sanctuaries especially that have steps up to the table or to the pulpit or those sorts of things, that even when we are talking about accessibility so frequently, and we do that with queer people too, there are so many different ways that we do that, but that we say, okay, how do we get it so that people can be members without thinking about leadership?
Right. And that's actually going to be part of my doctoral dissertation with my Doctor of Ministry program. Thinking about if our denomination says all are welcome, we all have a place, we're striving for diversity, why is it maybe not translating so much to the life of the church and in how we call people to different positions of leadership?
Yeah.
And I imagine that has to have something to do with the way that churches worked to not have the Americans with Disabilities Act apply to them in the 90s.
Yeah, in large part.
Yeah. Do you have a title for your dissertation yet? If not...
No, I don't. I'm only in my second year, so we're still in the classroom and learning phase and doing all kinds of reading right now and writing.
I promise I will not ask you how it's going.
Yeah.
I've learned that rule.
We've had a few different people on who are working in various places to write dissertations or not yet there. That's one of the questions where it's like, this could go one of two ways. You could hate that we're asking, or you could...
It's going, but I love it. I'm the only Lutheran in the group, so that's been a different experience, but a really good one and a rich one to learn from each other.
Sure.
So we're a cohort of 9, and a lot of it's been virtual right now, of course, but we've had at least one opportunity to have almost everyone in person, and we get together again in January. So rather than staying in a cold place in January, I get to go to Arizona for about 4 or 5 days. So
Ooh,
that'll be good.
That sounds lovely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as you were talking, one of the things that we kind of got a little bit into is the distinction between intentional and unintentional exclusion, right? I think there are times where we, in any group, intentionally exclude people. I think of the vagina monologues when I did them in college, and there was an intentional exclusion of people. And for some of that, it was good exclusion, and some of it was problematic exclusion. But there's also ways that it's unintentional, right? People just don't think of it. So I'm curious if you have some insights you could share about what those different ones look like, and if there's a different response or a different thing that needs to happen when those exclusions are brought out into the open.
You know, what I come across most often is unintentional exclusion. It's people who have maybe made a little bit of effort to make a change for access, but they have maybe not consulted the person who has the disability to see what their needs are. They've just thought they're doing the nice thing to make it better, and in the end it often doesn't work. So they're trying, but it still is a form of exclusion because you aren't a part of the conversation in making the thing accessible, whatever that might be. Or it could be simple things as you want to have an outside service for your congregation, but maybe you don't have really accessible seating, or you aren't thinking of folks who can't be out in certain types of climate because of autoimmune issues, things that just get forgotten about.
Yeah.
Then you have intentional exclusion, and I think some churches try to worm out of it when they say something's too expensive to do. If you want people with disabilities to be part of your community, you can figure it out. There are resources available. And so I think it's helpful to have leaders with disabilities help congregations along the way too. So instead of just being angry all the time and not wanting to help make things better, maybe helping guide congregations is a good alternative. Be mad, rage against the systems that make things inaccessible, but learn how can you help make things better too. Yeah.
I have for a long time talked about it as my role as a white, mostly able-bodied queer person who is a pastor. Part of my role at any given congregation is to make it so that that congregation is more likely to call someone after me who is different from me. So it could be as far as making it more accessible, or a person of color, a person whose first language is not English, but to do those pieces of the work. And then also expecting that of other pastors, right? Where they will do that work to get me in the door. But the leadership is key in that, to be able to be clear about the purpose and what it means to be the church and what it says about who we are as a congregation or as a church body when we don't do those things.
Right.
We put our money where our values are.
Exactly. And there are situations where ministries and congregations really are struggling, but I've seen struggling congregations go, okay, we can't afford to have a contractor come and do this thing, but we have woodworkers in our congregation who can, who are just as good. And that's a beautiful thing to see too. I was very fortunate in my first call that there were some very talented folks there that made a two-step chancel into a platform with a ramp on one side and left the two stairs on the other with a railing. And now that I'm no longer there, I still can rest knowing that some elderly folks in that congregation or people with some progressive disabilities can still participate in life there.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, and then there's a slightly more nuanced version of that, which would be the difference between making space for a person, which you already spoke to, or truly making them welcome.
Yes.
And the example that sprang to mind for me is I have several friends who are either celiac or need to be gluten-free for various reasons. It turns out you can actually be allergic to gluten, and that's a separate thing from being celiac, which I did not know before. So both effects are terrible, but they're terrible in different ways. So they've given me the example of offering gluten-free communion is one thing. Having the gluten-free communion handled correctly is a second separate thing.
Absolutely.
And then are there gluten-free snacks at fellowship when there isn't a pandemic and you can have fellowship?
Right.
And those are three very different levels of trying to welcome people.
That's very true.
Does that sound familiar too?
Yes, it does. You know, when I was a kid before the church building was rebuilt, I could go all over that sanctuary that I wanted to, except up the chancel steps. But when you're 6, 7 years old, you're not too concerned about being able to do that always. But
Sure.
getting downstairs to the basement for fellowship time or even some Sunday school classes didn't always work. And even my dad, who went from walking to crutches to electric wheelchair to a head controlled chair, there was no way if that new building had been built that he would have been able to participate fully. And up until his last years, he was on different boards and a Sunday school teacher and did all kinds of stuff. So it really showed us that building that new building was a priority, and they made it fully and completely accessible. So we went from, okay, you can go to church here, to being a part of the community once that new building was built.
Yeah. So my uncle had MS
Mm.
as well, and my cousin does now, and another aunt of hers, like that particular nook of my family, and the different ways that it has shown up and the different ways that it is connected with church. And it's a little bit different in that I think that part of the family is connected somewhat to their Catholic faith, but not necessarily in the going to worship every Sunday kind of thing that you, it sounds like, grow up with. But I also remember the spaces where the church also, there's the like, is it accessible? Can you come? But also, when you can't come, what are we doing? And so I remember my grandmother was a Eucharistic minister, and so she could bring communion to people. And my memories of my uncle, I don't think he could even move his wheelchair. He could type things out by his eye movements. But my grandmother would bring communion, and that would be the only thing that he actually ate. Everything else would be through a feeding tube, right? And then I remember, like, when she was dying, a priest came once to see her, and that was it. And she was in the hospital for about a month. And so those spaces of how are we not just welcoming people if they can make it to the building, but when they can't, what does that actually look like? Which I imagine is another layer in...
Mm-hmm. Well, and a layer that adds to that from my perspective is, how do I, a pastor with a significant physical, visible disability, maintain contact with the members who can't be present physically because of their own circumstances? So a lot of my ministry in the past, when I was full-time in a congregation, was connecting to people by the phone. And when some instances came about that were maybe longer term, a few times we used a set of ATV ramps that I have to get me into and out of a home, or calling a church member to say, hey, can you help me get up these couple steps into this family's house? So finding a way, and that was always something I wanted to do better. But a lot of it was through phone and other kinds of communication that way too. And relying on lay visitation as well. And trying to empower the people to do that, and not always succeeding, but being pleased when it did happen.
Yeah, I have told multiple congregations that part of it is that what we call pastoral care only became the pastor's job exclusively when pastors had to start justifying why they were getting paid to do work. And so before that, it was congregational care. And so I've done my best when it's part of my job description to, right, set up congregational care teams because they can do it a lot better. I despise talking on the phone. So if I have to do pastoral care via the phone, it will be very few and far between, because it's just not, like, that's where I think part of my anxiety comes. But so I'm very, very much admire your commitment to pastoral care over the phone, because I do think it's important, and I have had meaningful encounters with people via the phone. But
And the rest of the millennial generation appreciates your sacrifice, Emily.
you know, I try. But yeah, I think it's also an interesting conversation in the pandemic, particularly because we've gone from disabled people saying, why are your services not accessible? Why are things not online? All of that, to everything is online all of a sudden, to moving back into in-person worship. And the congregation that I just left has been doing in-person outdoor with masks required at parks that are accessible. Like, we have some people who have been really great in our congregation around accessibility. But then now we're at a place where I think a lot of congregations, if they are truly doing the care for the most vulnerable, need to go back to online for the winter, because the Delta variant is awful and there's more variants coming up and stuff. But there's also, like, when Trinity Las Americas finally does get to in person in the building, the ways we talk about, like, what it means to worship together virtually and in person, right? There are some where pastors are, like, going back and just getting rid of the online option, which is problematic. There are some where people are then just making it into a live stream and calling it hybrid worship, though there's not actually any interaction or overlap. And what we've been doing, we've had a consultant helping us think through and figure out how we actually have hybrid worship, where people can join from Zoom and can share something during prayers of the people, or could be a reader for scripture or whatever the case may be. And I think that's part of the complexities right now that we're thinking about in a pandemic, where it's all of us just want to be back together in person again. And we're desperate for it. But
We are. And I live in South Dakota, which is its own animal in the pandemic. So a lot of us
right here. Yeah.
So a lot of us are back in person, and we are in the building, and we're taking what precautions we can, but we're still getting a lot of pushback in some places. And it's frustrating to hear some folks say, well, not everyone's back because we have the online option. Well, it's more than that. We're still actively in a pandemic, so people aren't back in the building because they don't want to get sick or spread it to the community. And
or because they have kids.
Or, yes, exactly.
Exactly.
And I will say, when you do first come back, whether it was my prior congregation or the one I'm currently at, that first time back when you have a lot of people at full capacity, it's a little nerve-making. It doesn't feel good at first. But at the same time, you're like, it's still great in a way to see the people back, but you have that nagging in the back of your mind of, is this really hospitable and faithful right now, too?
Yep.
Yeah. My experience has been unusual because I was unemployed for the first round of the pandemic, and I started at my current place in the middle of May. But the conversation of, okay, so by our behavior, who are we welcoming, has been one of the most difficult ones that I've had with congregations before. And especially because so many of these decisions have been turned into political catchphrases.
Yeah.
Here in Iowa, we had a mask mandate ban. See, I told you I knew what you meant when you said South Dakota. I was like, God, Iowa. Just last week, finally got, or maybe the week before, by the time this comes out, I don't remember, got overturned by a federal judge so that schools can actually mandate mask wearing. 2 school districts in the Des Moines metro area have done it. But everybody's terrified of the governor because she went after one of the schools that did all online. And it's just like those sorts of things, though, that people are so concerned about, like, I don't want to wear a mask because it's gotten so political, that trying to get people back into the Christian thinking of how are we loving our neighbor? How are we protecting our neighbor? Right? The congregations that are doing in-person stuff in this area, none of those pastors have kids who are under the age of 12, right? Our congregation, the lead pastor, my previous congregation, literally recording this in my last week at the congregation, so I'm a little back and forth. He has 2 kids under the age of 5.
Wow.
Yeah.
They can't get a vaccination.
No.
Yeah.
It's so hard right now.
Yeah.
As we've said, I think we're forgetting about care for our neighbor. And that is a pandemic issue, and it's an out-of-pandemic issue. Because we want my Jesus, my worship, my way. And not the body of Christ.
Whereas some of us are hoping that masks stick around for a while when you know that you're ill and you have to go somewhere. Because I have now gone for like 18 months without having the nasty chest cold, and I would love to continue doing that.
Yep.
Right.
My life and my ministry has been so much easier because I haven't had to get over a new strain of whatever, because I am constantly around, frankly, children who are giant petri dishes.
Yeah.
Some of whom can walk.
Well, and the flu had, I think, fewer cases than in other years typically die. Fewer cases total than what in previous years had been like death toll of the flu because people wore masks and stayed inside.
Mm-hmm. This is the least I've been sick in years with head colds and anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of my best friends lovingly called me Petrie for a while. It was well deserved.
That's a little bit hilarious.
Yeah.
Does that mean that your immune system is especially welcoming as well?
It's my immune system from time to time, but related to my disability, actually. I had a pressure sore on my foot for about 6 years.
Ooh.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. And that was me trying to be independent and carrying a suitcase through an airport when I have no feeling in my feet. And I got a blister that went out of control. So that was during my internship year. So if I learned anything since then, it's the value of interdependence, you know?
Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that? I've heard of it, but I don't know if all our listeners have.
How I think about it is like all my life I've said I want to be as independent as possible because I know I can be. And it's not a situation that a certain population of those with disabilities are in. For whatever reason, their circumstances, independence looks a lot different or a lot harder for them. But what I'm learning over the years of, you know, foot sores and this thing or that thing happening is that it's okay to seek out help when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I get through my day-to-day life here without help? Yeah. But is it okay to have my groceries delivered? Yeah. Is it okay to have someone hand me something when I've dropped it or to help me across grass? Yeah, that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm any less of myself or less of a leader.
Yeah.
And I think I have absorbed that more since my internship year because that was something we talked about a lot.
That's a really good point. I think I have thought about that. So my mental health stuff is such that sometimes it can get hard for me to food myself.
Mm.
And I just I can look at a fridge full of food and I'm just like, there's nothing to eat. I know that there is food to eat. I just cannot get myself. And so that's been, especially as I've been leaving congregations and getting ready to move and all of those things, it was it is okay to in fact get a Grubhub membership.
Yes.
And get Grubhub with the frequency with which the membership saves itself money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In order to keep eating in this moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like with the community that I'm in right now, I have a burial on Monday morning. Instead of trucking myself out to the cemetery, I might call the paratransit bus and have it drop me off and come get me. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's a fear, I guess, of that looking poorly as the pastor needing public transportation, both self-perception and outer perception. But I'm learning to care less about the outer perception as long as I'm doing my job to the best of my ability.
And pastors in places with good public transit take public transit all the time.
Exactly.
It's just we in the Midwest are used to public transit being weird.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
I was going to say that part of that, too, is the way that classism impacts that, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
that
definitely.
Pastors, no matter what they're paid, are expected to be middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And middle class people in many places that are not like Chicago, New York, don't use public transportation.
Yeah.
We have our own cars and we drive our own cars and that's how we get places, and the church reimburses us so that we are the church's credit card, and all of those different teeny tiny things that especially get augmented when we think about the laws regarding the caps of how much people can have in their bank accounts if they're on disability, or whether or not they can get married.
Yeah.
Or if we qualify for loan forgiveness, categorized as a disabled person, but technically we don't because we can still work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very weird life being in the in-between with disability and aid and benefits and help. It's a weird place to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think in this conversation that we're having on inclusion and exclusion and who counts and who doesn't, it's reminded me of the conversation that Kay and I actually had last week. We talked about childism and children in worship, and the distinction between being Kay, I think you said it best. It was like, are children window decorations, or is worship designed for children or
Yes.
with children in mind?
Yeah.
And I think that's another piece of it that I notice as someone who these days is visibly queer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it that you want me to be a window dressing to prove that you're welcoming, or do you actually have me in mind?
Yeah.
When you are designing programs in worship.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, when it comes to that sort of a question, how you can tell the difference, or kind of how you navigate that.
The best example I could give is maybe where I'm currently serving. There's another wheelchair user who, there's a few that use wheelchairs in the congregation, but another one who's very active in the life of the congregation who I happen to know from years and years ago. And they are not just around in worship, they're on major decision-making boards, they're at different events, they're leading things. And I don't for a second get the sense that it's a tokenism thing. It's truly a welcoming and inclusive thing. Other times, when it's maybe been the opposite, it's not necessarily church, but my high school, when I was, I don't remember what year I was, maybe a junior, wanted to have a mural put up that showed the community celebrating our school.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who was the token model of a disabled person?
You were.
Me. Yeah. So there are things like that. And I think it's great that our worship books have in the front of them now, when they show groups of people, someone who uses a chair or another depiction of a visible disability. That's great. But I want to see it more in the active lives of our congregations beyond worship. And that's my goal with my work with disability ministries and my doctoral program, is how do we get there more? We're doing a lot better, but we've still got a long way to go. We're not just in worship for an hour and then we're not talking to the church till next Sunday. We're here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And not just to receive care, but to give care too.
Yeah.
And that's where, even denominationally and synodically, right? Which for the ELCA, our brand of Lutheranism, synodical is kind of like the middle level. But I mean, I remember in seminary, one of my friends was a Black woman, and she was in almost every picture that the seminary put out for publicity.
Oh,
Yep.
yes.
And it's those spaces where, like,
Mine did that too.
they actually did studies, and the more diverse the pictures, the less diverse the actual community.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Yep, and I think about that with the ELCA, and right now we've had a couple of really prominent first elections of bishops.
Yeah.
And for, all of the complexities of every person is a complicated person and not inherently 100% good and wonderful, there's also the complexity of the ELCA presenting these bishops and these steps as, like, really beautiful and great things without acknowledging that the ELCA itself holds a policy that says that no person in the ELCA is required to affirm a queer person, but like that it's perfectly fine to think that queer people are going to hell, right? Mm-hmm. Where we have this image that we're putting out as a denomination that actually then, when it comes to people going to a congregation, they could get really hurt really fast if the congregation is not welcoming, but the ELCA makes it look like they are. And I think I don't see that quite as much with disabilities, because I think the ELCA just is not even to the place of wanting tokenism disability in the same way, or wanting to wrestle with disability and access and accessibility. But that might be a little bit more of an...
I think it's, from my perspective as both a rostered leader in the ELCA and an employee of Churchwide in the job that I'm in, I can see where we are now having more of an opportunity to do that authentic inclusion and lifting up of folks with disabilities in leadership. I think in the past, years ago, it was, why would we even want to call someone who has a disability? We can't even fathom that. And now it's well, how can we? But we're still wrestling with lots of congregations that go, well, why would we?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of push and pull and struggle there. But I'm hopeful on the disability end of things that there is room for growth and change. And I know that being a coordinator for a program about disability as a person living with a disability is a big deal and very important.
Yes.
But I don't see it as just a token thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's their intention. But that's only from my experience, too. I can't speak to others' experiences from queer experience or person of color experience. I just can't, because that's not my perspective that I come at as a human. And it makes me really sad that we are saying so much we want to be inclusive and do so much good and be the full body of Christ, yet you look at however many of our churches and it's just, we're not there.
Yeah. We're not yet practicing what we preach.
No.
Yeah.
And that's what is kind of driving my dissertation work. Is I was seeing the ELCA move forward talking about race and sexuality and gender expression, but not so much about disability right now. And I didn't want it to be a competing thing. I want us to work together.
Yeah.
And that's a part of, like, my job description is intersectionality. And so I'm really excited to be making more ties that can hopefully move us all forward together.
Yeah.
But until there's congregational buy-in, we're stuck.
Sure.
Yeah. I think about that and the changes that have been made to to get rid of vision and expectations, and the changes that have been made to definitions and guidelines for discipline for rostered ministers, and the ways that they have and have not taken into account disability and accessibility and what it means to be healthy or whole, or who has access to marriage as a feasible option and who doesn't, both in an emotional, spiritual sense, but also in a practical survivability
Financial.
sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That is a growing edge for, I think, most churches, most denominations, but definitely as the three of us are ELCA pastors in the ELCA.
Yeah. There are so many committees that we have that govern who gets to do what and who gets to make which decisions. And those committees are so often not given any education whatsoever on what it means to be truly inclusive and welcoming, or what it means to welcome a person from a different culture, or from a different ability standpoint, or from a different sexual orientation, etc. And that leads to the stories that we often hear of how those meetings go horribly, horribly wrong sometimes. But
yeah. There are so many tangents I can go on as a leader with a disability, but I guess I choose to look to hope. And yeah, we're all messed up and broken and what have you, but I hope that we can, live as we preach,
Sure.
Yeah.
Because people will say, "Oh, Pastor, that was a great sermon." Okay, but how does that sermon impact your day-to-day life? Or how does that workshop on disability inclusion impact your ministry?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. How are you thinking differently about accessibility right now than you were beforehand?
Exactly. And I'm so appreciative of my team that I work with, because it's me and 4 volunteers, but we each have a different either allyship or lived experience with a different kind of disability. And where we don't have experience, we're open to learning and growing. And one thing, to speak well of my synod here, they've really gone to bat for me as a leader with a disability. They really have. But the thing that about shocked me out of my seat one day, maybe a year and a half ago now, my bishop called one day. And anytime your bishop calls, you're like, what's going on? We were getting ready for our spring theological conference that my former conference was supposed to lead, that got canceled because of the pandemic. But they were talking about a theme, and a theme for things coming up for the synod. And they were talking about, walking with Christ, going with Christ, whatever. And she goes, "But I realize that term walking is really ableist. I want to know what you think." And I was like, oh, wow. And I think that conversation was possible because she's a good leader, but also because we got to live in relationship with each other at the church-wide assembly the summer before. And so she got to see firsthand some of the things that I deal with.
Yeah.
And without that relationship, we wouldn't have been able to maybe have that inclusivity and conversation and other conversations that have happened since then. So I'm seeing a real investment in my synod leadership in inclusion with disability, knowing that we still all have a long way to go.
Of course.
But I'm very thankful for them in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in this search for a new call, they've been really good too. I don't want to sound like I'm, uplifting where it's unnecessary, but for myself, I can't be stuck in nothing's right.
Mm.
I want to affirm what we are doing right and call us to account where we're not.
Yeah. That's
Sure.
That's one of my perpetual struggles. It's easy for me to get buried in everything is awful.
Yeah,
no one is doing
it's
anything
so
right.
easy.
And that's part of what community helps me with, at least, is when I am feeling that way. And we have our weekly vigils outside the police station, and people show up. And then it's like, oh, right, there are good things. This is not all bad things.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is such a thing as righteous anger. And it absolutely has its place, whether it's frustration with congregational life or frustration with your denomination, whatever it might be. There's a place for that too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I do, as I think about though, there's something I saw probably on Facebook a while back, someone talking about the phrase all are welcome and really challenging that statement. Because are we? And making the point of, well, if things look this way, then this leaves this person out, or this way, then leaves this one out. And is full acceptance and inclusion possible? And that had me really thinking, is it? And I don't know that I have an answer for that.
Yeah, I think it is possible on a meta level, but not on a micro level. Right? So I don't think that there is a way necessarily for a space to be welcoming to someone who is abused and their abuser, right? And I think particularly like accessibility, what is accessible for one is not what is accessible for another.
Right.
So contextually, like a congregation, I think, has to, in some ways, like cast their lot with a particular group, but also that it's, okay, in your context, what are the accessibility needs? And how do you manage that? And then another congregation will have a different context and be able to have different accessibility needs. And another congregation will have a ministry that's intentionally with people who have been abusive and helping and supporting them in not being abusive.
Yep.
Yeah.
That we can do that on a macro level. I don't think we always do, but we can.
We can. Yeah. You're right.
And recognize the limitations of micro on a micro level.
It's like how accidentally sometimes one congregation in town will be the congregation for people who have therapy and support animals, like dogs, and then the other congregation will become the congregation for people who are violently allergic to dogs.
Yeah.
Or that kind of thing. And it reminds me of when we share community worship services. And just because the community needs a Thanksgiving Eve service or a Christmas Day service or whatever, doesn't mean that every single place has to have their own. Sometimes you can share.
Right. Absolutely.
So really this just takes us right back to kindergarten and learning how to share.
So much of it does, though.
Yeah.
One of my favorite, it's not the scriptures for this week, but the Isaiah image of the banquet and the shroud of darkness being lifted and everybody being able to come to this mountain. I'm like, okay, yes, but when and how do we get there? And we can't get there by ourselves. We mess it up too much.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we don't do anything either. It's frustrating when congregations are willing to do nothing for inclusion, whatever that means in their context. It's disheartening.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, we don't have anyone who needs that.
Yeah.
Well, you don't know who's moving to town next week, do you?
I've had that conversation so many times.
Also, maybe there's a reason you don't have anyone who needs that if you haven't been providing it.
Exactly. You're not just planning for the people who are already there. You're planning for the people who are coming. And for yourselves, because frankly, you're going to get old and not be able to use steps when you're 90.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, for all the semi-liberal mainline Protestant congregations like to complain about the non-denominational megachurches, the thing that non-denominational megachurches do is they make sure, generally, that they are able to physically welcome people. I have been to a number of them, and they all have wheelchair ramps. They all have buildings that meet modern building code and therefore allow people throughout the building, that kind of thing.
And then I would want to take a deeper look at what they say theologically about those with disabilities. Because I've definitely been that junior high, high school kid that is tugged to the front of the group and, prayed over for healing, whether you wanted that prayer said for you or not.
Oh, God.
Yeah. In our James reading today, the very end of it, I read, and we're not talking about it necessarily later on in the episode, but the very end of it, the author writes, "My siblings, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and is brought back by another, you should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins." And the amount of assumptions that go into how we identify who a sinner is that needs bringing back. And that space of, right, as a visibly queer person, I have one way that people automatically will identify me as the sinner. But like you were saying, right, where it's, we have to pray over you and heal you. And it's like, that's not consensual at all.
No. Or, in other texts talking about who sinned that this person can't see or walk or hear or whatever. Is it the parents? And how that still translates into today. And my mother's own struggles with have an adult child who has a disability. What did I do? Well, you know what, Mom, you gave me a pretty dang good life, so deal. But still not dismissing the grief, too, of no one wants a kid who's seemingly sick when they're an infant, that kind of thing. Yeah. But, yeah, it's real awkward being pulled in, like, in the middle of your high school hallway and asked, can we pray for you?
Yep.
As an aside, I did have someone do that to me when I was in early high school in my home church. It was a family's granddaughter who came to visit. And she asked if she could pray for me, and I was like, sure. And apparently in the middle of the fellowship hall in that moment was the time to pray for me. And very occasionally, if I'm cold or if I've hit my foot on something, I'll feel a muscle twitch. So nothing happened right then as she was praying for me, but I transferred into the car to go home, and as she's heading out to her family's car, my leg twitches. And I just started laughing because I knew exactly what the problem was, but I was fighting that urge to roll down my window and go, hey!
I felt the twitch.
I mean, you have to have some kind of humor when those things come about.
Yeah.
And it just depends on where your line of what's okay and what isn't okay to joke about is, too.
I know of some people who, when somebody says, can I pray for you? They're like, actually, let me pray for you first. And then it's like this whole turning the tables thing that's really brilliant. But yeah,
great.
It does, you got to be in the right place.
Yep.
Space to do it.
Yeah, you do.
So, Lisa, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
I don't think I have much else, just to say thank you for asking me to be on. And if you follow stuff with the ELCA or don't, I'm involved with Disability Ministries, and we have some great things coming down the pike. So, things that we'll be really proud of to share.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And now as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6, 10 through 16, and 24 through 29, because we like to be complicated. The Israelites complained to Moses and God about the monotony of manna, and Moses complains to God about the Israelites. God's gift of prophecy to the elders leads to unexpected new prophets among the Israelites.
Side note, I want to point out that Monotony of Manna would be an excellent praise band name.
Oh my gosh, that is fantastic. I was thinking about it and I was like, that's alliterative. I like that. It sounds good, but did not think band name. And now Monotony of Manna, if you create that band name or name your praise and worship band Monotony of Manna, let us know, because we will definitely shout you out on a future podcast episode. In this passage, one of the themes that I noticed was the idea of gatekeeping. And Lisa talked about it a little bit, right? The idea of why would we let those people in? Let those people be our pastor.
Yeah.
And in this, it's why would those two elders be allowed to be prophets when clearly they've been given the gift of prophecy?
Yes.
And I was thinking about the series called the Expanse. And there's this point at which this giant ring is created in the outer solar system, and there's a gatekeeping that starts to happen of who is allowed to go through the ring. First, it's nobody's allowed into it, but then also adding that is who is allowed to go through the ring, who is allowed access to the ring, all of those things. And it's interestingly, it's partly the people who are most marginalized who then become the gatekeepers, because the only way for them to keep the little bit of power they have is to be the gatekeepers for everybody else with more power on getting through the ring.
And I think that parallels something that happens in real life when people who have experienced marginalization wind up gatekeeping other people because they need what they have, and that's the only way they see to hang on to it.
Mm-hmm. One of the counters to that, as Lisa mentioned, is the idea of interdependence, right? The recognition that we are interdependent, that we depend on each other, is part of what resists the pressure to become a gatekeeper. The theology of scarcity, of, no, this is all I have, I must cling to it with my every last breath.
Yeah, which is usually how you wind up becoming a supervillain, I'm just saying. But...
True. Don't become a supervillain, please. Yeah.
Or at least if you're going to become a supervillain, have a nice costume. Come on, let's have some, excitement. I'm just saying. Yeah.
And then in verse 4, we read, "The rabble among them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, 'If only we had meat to eat.' And I could not help but think of the hobbits as they received the lembas, where they're like, right, Legolas is like, satisfied after a little nibble, and the hobbits look at each other and they're like, how many have you had? How many have you had? And it's like 2 or 3 since breakfast. Right? But it's also the sorrow with which they eat, like, this is not nearly as good as a whole feast and all of the meat and all of the other things to eat.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, when I read verse 5, we remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. So I was not really into the Redwall books when they were popular, but I have since met a bunch of people who have told me that they specifically tried out vegetarianism because of the descriptions of the meals in these books, which were all vegetarian because the characters were all very tiny animals who are vegetarian, rodents and so forth. Mice who are monks are the main characters, is my understanding. And one of the things that was especially notable about the books was how the author described the food, in that the author described the food in these meals much like J.R.R. Tolkien would describe a forest, lovingly and at great length. And so I realize there is a quick mention of fish in this line, but it does seem like the same kind of loving description, which I also, on a more complicated note, realized that this is probably a rose-colored glasses reflection on the part of the people who have just escaped Egypt. I very much doubt they actually got fish for nothing, or if they did, it was terrible fish. So, yeah, we're keeping that in mind, too.
Yeah. But it is, like, I was struck by how deliciously they describe it too, where I was like, wow.
Yes, exactly.
We don't usually get this much description of the food in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or when we do, it's really terrible. Don't boil meat.
Right.
Anyway.
It's very detailed, or they ate together.
Yeah. Yeah, what did they have for the Last Supper besides the bread and wine? So,
I mean, according to every painting, nothing. Just a bunch of bread and wine.
Well, as opposed to, I think John Mulaney had a bit when he was married to his first wife about his first wife asking that question, and then I guess assuming that they were eating turkey, because, Thanksgiving. Why not? And then in verse 11 we read, "So Moses said to the Lord, 'Why have you treated your servant so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all these people on me?'" So I kind of get 2 somewhat nerdy references from this verse. One reminds me very much of Jimmy Stewart from It's a Wonderful Life, in that one scene where he complains to his wife, "Why did we have all these kids anyway?" Which, since becoming an adult, I have met so many parents that actually have those moments in real life.
Nice.
Like, the generation above me did not have those moments in front of me. I'm sure they had those moments, but not when I was around. But my generation definitely has those moments in front of me. And then, of course, the other reference that immediately popped into my head was from Wicked. "No good deed goes unpunished." because it seems like Moses' good deeds have returned him a variety of tasks that he is not especially enjoying, which is, I think, something many of us can relate to.
Indeed. So. Also, I love that you broke into song this time.
Yay! I tried.
I was not quite on top of it enough to join you in that, but yeah, I do love, I love Wicked. It's a good show. Well, and I was reading in verse 14. I prepared this one in 2 different times, so did not realize that I had 2 Expanse examples in the same one. But in verse 14, when we read Moses' complaint, I am not able to carry all this people alone, for they are too heavy for me. It reminded me of the scene in The Expanse where Eros, one of the asteroid belts, has been basically contaminated, poisoned, condemned as an experiment by billionaires, which, is not surprising given the world we live in today. But the Rocinante...
Oh, billionaires.
Right. But the Rocinante, the ship that the main characters are on, is trying to get people off, but they weren't able to refill their oxygen reserves, and so they don't have enough O2 for all of the people that they need to get on, and yet all of the people are there and they will die if they don't get on the Rocinante. And so it's this, we cannot carry everybody alone. And this is what we have to do. And trying to figure out those pieces of who gets saved and how. And it's us. Sure. But hard decision.
Because it turns out that having to ration care always sucks.
Yeah. Causes
and you can't help everyone.
Moral injury.
Not that our healthcare system is currently dealing with that.
Yeah. Moral injury. Bad thing.
Our second reading for today is from James chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. The author exhorts us to pray in every circumstance, with Elijah as an example.
So one of the themes in this passage that I immediately thought of as I was reading it is thoughts and prayers. The idea of thoughts and prayers, which so frequently is an excuse for inaction, right? Every time there is mass violence or some mass catastrophe, politicians send thoughts and prayers, when in fact it would be better if they sent money, aid, resources, restrictions on guns, those sorts of things.
Policies and laws that actually helped.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think there's a difference between the thoughts and prayers as an excuse for inaction and thoughts and prayers as a step towards action. And so I think that dynamic changes things.
Yeah.
But also prayer is also more expansive. And so when we think about prayer, particularly in terms of what prayer is, and we talked about this some in our episode for the 7th Sunday of Easter, that prayer can be lots of things. So prayer isn't just the folding hands, bowing heads, but can also be the showing up and taking action and responding and that sort of thing.
In the same way that hymns are prayers, action can be prayers as well.
Yes. That. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 14, the author writes, "Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of God." So there's one thing that I want to point out, especially in light of what Lisa said earlier, is this is, if you are sick, then you call the church elders, not if someone else is sick.
Yes.
Send the church elders on them. So there's some consent here. But also this reminded me of the episode of Firefly where this town, everybody's been getting sick and stuff, and so they kidnap Simon, who is a doctor, to heal the people in the village because their prayer wasn't quite working, and they somehow...
Well, that might depend on what the prayer was for, but yes.
Well, yes, but somehow they justify kidnapping a doctor to do what they need done while still being scared of his sister, who they've decided is a witch, and,
Yes.
Christian contradiction.
Yeah, I might say that on the one hand their prayer worked because it spurred them to action, on the other hand it definitely didn't work because that was not the correct action.
Mm-hmm.
Offering him a job would have been an option.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you ask God for healing, what you are asking for is, or what you wind up getting is, less healing of whatever you're dealing with and more the healing of your mind and heart while you're going through it, which at least is something.
Yeah, and for some, that healing and wholeness is no longer being in pain, and that's okay.
And then in verse 15 we read, "The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up, and anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. I just want to throw out there, I mean, on this note and related to what we've been talking about, just because the Bible says that we should pray for the sick, and we do pray for the sick, that doesn't mean that we don't seek out proper medical care for the sick. God gave us brains along with everything else and expects us to use them. Thank you very much.
Yep.
And relatedly, if you want to see a really excellent take on prayer and what does prayer mean and faith healing done by a show where the main character is an atheist, the TV show House has an excellent episode, I believe in the first season, with a faith healer, which is, for all that House has absolutely no respect for religion of pretty much any stripe, the show does a lovely job of dealing with the nuances.
Nice.
And that was a very good episode.
I was going to say, I think there was an episode on Grey's Anatomy that also did that, but I don't remember how well or poorly they did it. But if you do, let us know, listener.
Yeah, an interesting twist with the House episode was that the faith healer was like 16, and so there was the faith healer, and then there was also his dad. And that created some interesting contrast.
Yeah, weird.
And then also in verse 17 we read, Elijah was a human being like us, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. So, 3 years and 6 months is 42 months, so here we see that prayer is actually the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. Thank you, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Good work, Elijah.
Also, fun fact that I just learned from one of our avid listeners, Matt Bird, shout out to you, is in computer programming. Like, I don't have it on my laptop, but when I grew up, I had a number keypad on the right.
Sure.
So if you press and hold Alt and then press 4 and 2, it makes an asterisk. And so that's also like one of the symbols that come up if there's like an error or something. And so it's entirely possible that, in fact, the number 42, the answer to life, the universe, and everything, was an error. Was just like, error.
Which would explain a lot, given the very confusing messaging on the multiplication tables that those books have.
Yep. And I was looking at verse 17 and 18 as well, and thinking about Elijah praying first that it doesn't rain and then praying that it does. And it reminded me of a very, very early Doctor Who episode. So I was trying to go back through and watch Doctor Who from the very beginning. And it's hard because the episodes are sporadic and some episodes have just been lost. But there's one series of episodes where they go way back in time to, and this is a racist portrayal of Indigenous people, but they go back in time and there's like human sacrifices happening and somebody has predicted when the solar eclipse will happen. And so they're like, yes, the gods are going to get mad at us at this time and then we'll pray and we need to sacrifice at this time to make it better. But it's actually just like predicting something that is going to happen. And so the doctor's like, So then it got me wondering if that was what Elijah did. If Elijah was just like, it's not going to rain for the next 3 years and 6 months. And so I will pray for it to not rain. It's a little harder when it's like years of no rain, I suppose.
Yeah. And I'm trying to think of what it was, and I cannot come up with the name of it. But I could swear that Whoopi Goldberg did the same thing, either in a movie or a TV episode, where she got sent back in time with a laptop and realized what had happened, and real quick on the laptop on her, encyclopedia program on her laptop, looked up historical stuff that had happened at around that time, and so she predicted, I think it was an eclipse. Mm-hmm. And managed to prove to the people that she was, like, magical and that saved her life or something.
Huh. Way to go, Whoopi Goldberg. Of course she would do that.
Yeah.
And then our gospel reading for this episode is Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 50. The disciples want Jesus to stop a stranger from using Jesus' name to heal others. Instead, Jesus instructs them to not put stumbling blocks in front of others and focus on their own sins and faults so they don't lose the sense of who they are. So one of the themes in this is responsibility and accountability, particularly in leadership. A couple days before we're recording this, so last week, for the week that this comes out, there was a Senate judicial investigation happening into the FBI's investigation of Larry Nassar, the coach for U.S. Olympic gymnastics, who abused countless gymnasts.
Yeah.
And so there was this trial happening to, he's already been charged, he's in prison for decades, but this one is to hold the FBI accountable for not doing a good enough job in their investigation. And so I just think
those stories were pretty horrifying.
Yeah, right. But the like responsibility and accountability of leadership, it's not just the initial people who let Larry Nassar get away with all of the things, but then even in the investigation into the harm that he caused, they didn't even do their job to a good enough standard. And so it sucks because the gymnasts and others who are victims are having to relive again and again because people are not being responsible and accountable with their power and their leadership.
Yeah, but hopefully at least they've stopped it from happening again.
Hopefully.
In verse 40, we read, "Whoever is not against us is for us," which is a phrase I've heard in a number of different settings, but also known as, "Don't waste time going out looking for fights when you're already struggling." Okay? That's one way to interpret it. And this immediately made me think of the musical Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton may seem like the last guy to ever teach this lesson, like he was just constantly going out for fights and constantly struggling. That is his life. But in the song Jefferson or Burr, he realizes that even though he and Jefferson have, as he puts it, fought on like 75 different fronts, they are ultimately on the same side in one way. They both believe in standing up for what they believe in. And in that moment, Jefferson is not against him, and therefore Hamilton, for once, exactly once in his life, is actually for him.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I read verse 40 and was thinking about Blanca in Pose, because she had this real clarity of purpose, and at a couple points, the rivalries in the ballroom community were big enough that they threatened to crack the community itself. And Blanca responded with such clarity and poise and pose even that the community, like, yeah, there's ballroom rivalries, but the competition is the ballroom. The competition is not in life. In life, we are for us because nobody else is going to be for us. And that commitment to being together in that is just beautiful.
Yeah. And then in verse 47, we read, "And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out." So, hey, if you think looking at someone is causing you to sin, then you should stop looking at them, whatever the genders of the people involved are, or lack thereof.
It's like you're responsible for your own lust issues.
Exactly. But I tell you what, I will be loving and generous, as Christians should be, and so therefore, as an acknowledgement of the fact that it's been a few thousand years since this was written, and we have thankfully had some medical advances in that time, I will give you a little extra space and say that it's okay if what you choose to do here is wear an eye patch until you can get to an actual doctor to have it removed. Rather than just going the whole Minority Report thing and going underground to get somebody who you have no idea whether they have any medical qualifications to do it. That would be a bad plan. No, seriously, go to an actual doctor. Like, I would love to have the conversation where you explain to them what you're having done and why, recorded, like, for posterity, but that's not truly necessary and probably a little selfish on my part. So
That's fantastic.
Also, don't leave spoiled food in the fridge. That's just rude. But speaking of Minority Report.
Oh, okay. I was like...
Have you not actually seen that?
I don't remember. I know my sibling did, and we have there are different ways in which our family does not do well with blood, and I'm usually better than my sibling, but I remember the story of having to walk out of the theater, so I don't know if I ever actually saw it, or if I just had the parts of it described to me, because the eye thing sounds familiar, but...
Yeah, that was unpleasant.
Yeah. And then in verse 50, we read, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." So aside from the fact that I am just in general thrilled with Jesus' affirmation and approval of saltiness and of people being salty.
Go forth and be salty.
What it actually made me think of was Sam bringing the box of seasoning from the Shire, and it actually like almost gets Frodo killed, right? Because they're going down the rope, and then the seasoning falls out of Sam's backpack, and he goes, "Oh no, Frodo, get it!" And in trying to get it, Frodo lets go of the rope and falls back, but he's only like a couple feet off of the ground at that point. They just couldn't tell because of like cloud and fog coverage. But it's like the seasoning is so, and I love that about Sam, right? There is such purity in purpose and in what he's doing that like the seasoning is the thing.
Yes.
That he actually like still
So
cherishes.
What do you think the seasoning was?
Well, I'm about to move / by the time this episode comes out, will have moved to Maryland. So in honor of that, I would say probably the seasoning was Old Bay, but...
I was wondering if the Shire had a version of Mrs. Dash that might actually be Mrs. Gamgee. But
that's fantastic. That would also work very well.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 19th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH. Or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.